and talk a little bit about neural control of blood pressure, okay? Because at the end, I had you guys write up that little Socrative quiz, okay, about what would happen to baroreceptors, what would happen to blood pressure if baroreceptors were stimulated, and many of you were a little confused about how this works, okay? So I wanted to go back, and before I continue to go on and talk about hormonal control of blood pressure, I want to go back and revisit this, okay? So the nervous system and the endocrine system help control your body, right? We learned that last semester. Yes? Agree? All right. Nervous system control is very quick, all right? It's a faster control system than the endocrine control system. They are not necessarily mutually exclusive. In other words, they don't do things completely on their own. There is some crosstalk between the two, okay? In this case, what you see in this picture are the neural mechanisms that help control blood pressure, okay? First off, how can we control blood pressure in general? What is blood pressure equal to? Think about the equation. Emma. All right, well, heart rate affects what? All right, so cardiac output multiplied by peripheral resistance, okay? So anything that affects cardiac output can affect heart rate, right? Because that's heart rate times or stroke volume, okay? And then peripheral resistance can be your viscosity of the blood. It could be vessel length. And then also could be lumen diameter. Right? Altering these things will alter peripheral resistance. Okay? So, the question then is, what's the input that drives these changes? Okay? The set point, right? The homeostatic set point is going to be different for all of us, but our resting blood pressure, textbook-wise, is 120/80. Right? So that's our set point. Now, we all have different ones. Okay? In lab, you probably took your blood pressure at some point. Yes? And you notice it, maybe it's 118/75 or something like that, but it's pretty close to 120/80 for the most part. Okay? So we all have our separate set points, and that is where the body wants to keep blood pressure. All right? So if cardiac output goes up, right? If it goes up, what's going to happen to peripheral resistance? It's going to go down, right? Because these things want to keep this equal. But if blood pressure goes up, right? If blood pressure rises, cardiac output, either cardiac output or peripheral resistance have to rise with it. Okay? So this proportion, this relationship is very important, okay? If you understand the relationship, you can go through the different things, different factors that help control this relationship, okay? So let's talk about one of them, all right? So nervous system input can control a couple different things. If you look up to the top right-hand corner, vasomotor center, but this cardiac center, what do you think that controls? Heart rate, okay? And there are pretty much ways to increase heart rate and decrease heart rate, which will change cardiac output, right? So we can speed it up and produce more, increase blood pressure, but we also have to have a way to slow things back down, okay? In your car, you have an accelerator and a brake. Okay? You're driving the motor. Think about the heart as being the motor, analogous to the motor. You're going to make the motor go faster. You can make the motor slow down. Okay? So, cardio-acceleratory center, cardio-inhibitory center. So we can speed it up and slow it down. Within there, there's this vasomotor center. What do you think that controls? Vessels, right? So this will change your lumen size, right? And that's vasodilation. Vasoconstriction. If we change the lumen size, what happens? What part of that equation are we affected? Are we doing cardiac output? We're doing changing peripheral resistance. Okay? So now there's what you see in this blood vessels, right? There's these other sympathetic neurons that go different places. They come from the cardiac inhibitory center, the vasomotor center, and things go out, right? Sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. So the parasympathetic nervous system will slow things down, okay? Will lower blood pressure, will rest and digest, okay? And lower heart rate, while the sympathetic nervous system will increase blood pressure, increase heart rate, and alter vasoconstriction. Okay, so if you see blood vessels here on the right-hand panel, right over here, well, left-hand panel for you, on my right when I'm looking at it, there's two ways to control this. Some vessels have alpha-1 receptors, some have beta receptors. Okay, same sympathetic nervous system input, different response because of the different receptors that are there. So some vessels, when the sympathetic nervous system input, will constrict, others will dilate, and that directs flow. It also changes where it changes blood pressure as well. Okay? And then to the right-hand panel, you have receptors. These receptors will recognize stimuli. You have baroreceptors and chemoreceptors. Baroreceptors react to pressure changes. They react to the stretch of vessels or wherever or the organ that they're associated with. Okay? So think of an organ in your body that stretches in response to something. How many ate lunch? I saw Mike at lunch, right? I had a nice buffalo chicken wrap. Yeah, it was good today too, John. Where were you? Anyways, okay? What happens after you eat lunch? Your stomach stretches, okay? And in your stomach, you have baroreceptors that respond to that stretch, and they give that input back to the brain to say, you're full, okay? So the baroreceptors are going to respond to stretch here, and that input then goes to the cardio inhibitory or to the cardiac center, right? Goes to the brain to change, to alter blood pressure. Okay? So if they recognize that there's a really big stretch, what does that mean for blood pressure? If the vessels are stretching, what's the pressure? High or low? It's high. Okay? So the input is we have high blood pressure, let's slow things down. We have to do something else to kind of counteract that. Okay? But if the pressure becomes too low, then heart rate has to go up to counteract too low pressure. And it kind of works as a negative feedback back and forth. Okay? So you have those in a couple different places. Those pressure receptors are in the carotid sinus, which goes to where? Common carotid goes to where? The head. Okay? Your body is made to maintain blood going to the brain because it controls everything, right? So there's one important part. Second is the aortic arch, right? If blood's not coming out fast enough, not enough is coming out, we will need that input right away because it's not going to be able to provide blood to the whole system if there's not enough pressure coming out of it. All right? So think of it as like this, you're going to build this machine. My father-in-law is a combustion engineer. Okay? So he goes in, helps maintain power plants for big universities and big companies, right? There's all these quality control things to make sure that the steam plant that's producing the steam, right, the heat is getting down to your dorm, right? So if it's not coming out in the power plant from the source and it can't get to the furthest dorm, we have an issue in that furthest dorm, right? So we have to check that quality control as it's coming out and along the system if necessary. Okay? And that's what's happening here. Questions on baroreceptors. and neural input up to there. Okay? The last thing we have is chemoreceptors. They respond to chemicals, and we touched on this at the end of class on Wednesday. Chemoreceptors, they respond to chemicals such as the amount of carbon dioxide in the blood, the amount of oxygen in the blood, the pH of the blood. Okay? And so they react in a similar way that the baroreceptors, they sense those chemicals and then start an action potential, start a stimulus that goes to the brain, and then will help affect blood pressure, cardiac output, heart rate, right, in response to these things. Questions on neural inputs. These are fast acting. Okay? And for the most part, what's the target of the neural input? What's the main target? Most of it is here. Most of it's in the heart. Okay? There are some that will affect peripheral resistance, but for the most part, we are going to attack the factor that we're going to help control is heart rate more than anything. Okay? So, which means we move to hormones. Okay? The endocrine system works with the nervous system and will produce hormones that will help regulate blood pressure. Okay? One of the neurotransmitters you have from the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system is what? What's the sympathetic nervous system? When you get all fight or flight, what is that called? What's the neurotransmitter that's responsible for that? Fight or flight? Epinephrine. You get that adrenaline rush, right? Epinephrine. Well, epinephrine is produced by neurons, but it's also produced from where? It's produced from the adrenal gland, right? So the adrenal gland, here's your kidney. Adrenal gland sits on top of the kidney, this like little triangle thing. Okay? And it produces epinephrine and norepinephrine as a hormone. That's produced and it is released into the kidney and then into the bloodstream and works systemically. Okay? So the same neurotransmitter that's released as a sympathetic nervous system response can also affect the whole body when it comes from the adrenal gland. Okay? So sympathetic, norepinephrine, they work in conjunction with this. But in this case, they need to be talked about in terms of a hormone because they are being released from somewhere else and they're affecting the whole body through the blood. Okay? And so all the sympathetic nervous system inputs that we talked about are now going to happen not only from a neural standpoint, but now from a hormonal standpoint. Why is that important? Why is it's just not happening from a nervous system input, but also from an endocrine system input? If I have one input that increases heart rate, and then I have another one that increases heart rate, what happens to the overall stimulus? What happens to the overall output? Are they going to work against each other? They're going to work additively, right? So you get a really big response from a sympathetic nervous. You get scared or you get into a fight, what happens to your heartbeat? It goes up really, really fast, right? Because you're ready to go. You're ready to respond to some type of emergency, some type of excitement, okay? And that is meant so not only the nervous system input, but the hormonal control happens in order to enact all of that stuff, all of those responses at once in a quick fashion. Okay? So that's why that additive response allows it to happen quickly. All right? With that, there are other hormones that work to regulate blood pressure. So we talk about epinephrine, norepinephrine. The other ones are the Renin-Angiotensin System, or angiotensin 2. We're going to talk about that, and we will talk about this more when we cover the renal system in about a month. Okay? Antidiuretic hormone, aldosterone, and atrial natriuretic peptide, ANP. Okay? all of these hormones are released by different areas, different glands, but most of them, all of them, influence pressure through effects, and I put it in bold for a reason. Most of the time, they influence pressure by changing blood volume, altering blood volume. Okay? So how does altering blood volume affect blood pressure? So if I have, what's blood pressure equal to? Okay. Now, so the question is, how does altering blood volume, where does it work into this equation? Stroke volume. The only other part of this equation, right, was heart rate. The only other thing that's involved in volume in here is this right here, stroke volume. Okay? What is stroke volume dependent upon? Think back to the cardiac cycle when we talked about it. The amount of blood pumped out of the heart. How much is being pushed out during a contraction depends upon, we went over 3 factors that it depended upon. What's that? End diastolic volume, which was also called what? Afterload, right? Afterload. And what else? We had talked about afterload. What's well before that? Preload. Okay? So afterload, preload, those 2 things are really important. All right? And preload is one of the biggest ones. Okay? Because if you reduce blood volume, what happens to the amount of blood coming back to the heart? That's preload. What happens? It's reduced. It's reduced. So if preload's reduced, what's going to happen to stroke volume? It's going to be reduced. If stroke volume is reduced, what happens to cardiac output? It's reduced. And then eventually what happens to blood pressure? All right? You guys see the chain now. Okay? You see the chain. So what we're going to end up doing with these hormones, we're going to alter blood volume. Okay? So how do we alter blood volume? What system do you use in your body to alter and regulate blood volume? The renal system. Okay? So I see lots of water bottles. You drink a bunch of water to the day, right? That's going to be consumed, moves into the blood. That water, what happens to your blood volume? It goes up. What do you end up doing in response? You end up going to the bathroom a lot, okay? Because your body's regulating and keeping a normal, a set point volume of blood, okay? And there are the hormones that are controlling that are angiotensin 2, antidiuretic hormone, aldosterone, and ANP, okay? But it all helps to regulate blood pressure. And there's some other reasons why that happens, and we'll go over that when we get to the renal system. But right now, we're going to be concentrating on blood pressure, okay? So this is the Renin-Angiotensin System. The angiotensin system is a cascade, all right? A cascade of reactions similar to what we talked about when we talked about hemostasis, blood clotting, okay? One enzyme is released, and that activates another enzyme, okay? So we'll start at number 1 here. The kidney. There's receptors in the kidney that detect low blood pressure. What were those receptors? What would be the general name of those receptors? So if you have receptors in the kidney that recognize low blood pressure, what would the name of those receptors be? Taylor. Baroreceptors, right? Generally that there would be baroreceptors. Okay? So they're stimulated by the sympathetic nervous system. Okay? And in response to that, renin is released from the kidney into the blood. So renin is your number 1 hormone. Okay? Well, renin is an enzyme. and it converts angiotensinogen, the inactive form of angiotensin, to angiotensin 1. Okay? So renin is going to start this reaction, this cascade of events. It converts angiotensinogen, inactive hormone, to another inactive hormone, angiotensin 1. And then another enzyme, ACE, right? ACE converts angiotensin 1 to angiotensin 2. Angiotensin 2 now is the active hormone. And that's now it's going to do its job. Okay? And so at the bottom here, angiotensin 2 then is going to increase blood pressure by a couple different mechanisms. Number one, vasoconstriction. What part of the equation does vasoconstriction work on? Is it cardiac output or is it peripheral resistance? All right, so what happens to peripheral resistance? Vessels constrict, peripheral resistance goes up, blood pressure starts to go up. Okay? Stimulating your thirst center. What is that going to do? You feel thirsty. What are you going to do?
Drink water.
You're going to drink water, which then in turn increases your blood volume. Okay? What happens to blood pressure? It goes up. Third, it decreases urine production. So it stops the removal or the loss of water. It signifies tells the kidneys to absorb more water from the urine. Okay? What's going to happen to blood volume? It's going to go up. Okay? John?
This is kind of off topic, but how do kidney stones form? Is that totally different from this process?
Can we go revisit that when we get to the renal system?
Yeah.
Because that's a good, we'll talk about that when we do renal system. Okay? Because it really doesn't have much to do with this. It has a lot to when we talk about how the kidneys work, and the kidneys don't secrete enough calcium, and stones form.
You just said about storing water.
So the kidneys are going to regulate blood volume by regulating, determining how much water is lost, excreted, or it's retained. Okay? So if we're going to decrease urine formation, we're going to retain more water. Okay? We retain more water, our blood volume goes up. Okay? Blood volume goes up, what happens to blood pressure? It goes up because our stroke volume goes up with our normal cardiac output. Okay? So we understand the relationships. I'm really pushing the relationship. So if you can integrate all of this stuff, then when I give you this paragraph-long case study question on an exam, you're like, oh, I got this. You can write it out. You can just intuitively go through it.
Is it all a direct relationship? So like as each part increases?
Yes, because of the relationship, so cardiac output, times, those all directly proportional, they are pretty much a direct relationship. The one you have to worry about is diameter of a lumen size, right? If we're talking about blood flow. Okay? Right here. Increases blood pressure by vasoconstriction, thirst center. All of those things are, but we're talking about pressure, it should all be pretty much direct. All right? Next, antidiuretic hormone. Okay? ADH helps to maintain and elevate blood pressure. So, what did the Renin-Angiotensin System do? Did it decrease or did it raise blood pressure?
Raised.
It raised it, right? By vasoconstriction, decreased urine production or retaining water, right? ADH is going to do the same thing. Okay, ADH is released from the posterior pituitary, so it's a hormone. Okay, the release of this is triggered by nerve signals from the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus is stimulated by an increased blood concentration, right, overall, or angiotensin 2. So Renin-Angiotensin, right? We go from angiotensinogen to angiotensin 1 to angiotensin 2, and angiotensin 2 can also stimulate the release of ADH. So these two things are going to work together. All right? So ADH increases water reabsorption in the kidney. What happens to blood volume? Increases. Right? Stimulates the third center. Increased blood volume. Right? And large amounts cause vasoconstriction. So what we talked about in terms of the angiotensin 2, this is also augmented. All of those three things we just talked about, augmented by ADH. Okay, so so now those two things together, additive, both angiotensin 2 and ADH together are increasing blood volume. Okay? Aldosterone helps maintain blood volume and pressure. Aldosterone comes from the adrenal cortex. Its release is triggered by several stimuli, including angiotensin 2. So angiotensin 2 does some of this on its own and then recruits a couple of other helpers, ADH and aldosterone. All right, and in this case, aldosterone decreases urine output, which will lead to what? Increased what? Increased blood volume. Okay? So the way aldosterone does this is a little different though. Okay? It doesn't stimulate the kidneys to reabsorb water. It stimulates the kidneys to absorb sodium ions. Okay? Sodium ions, and when the sodium ions are retained, water goes with it. Okay? So it ends up being the same output or the same goal, endpoint, but a different mechanism of how to get there. Okay, so we have angiotensin 2, ADH, and aldosterone. They work together to increase blood pressure. Well, we need something that can actually work against that. So you can regulate that, right? Either you produce more or you produce less of those three things, and blood pressure will go up and down. Okay? Counteracting that is atrial natriuretic peptide, ANP. This decreases blood pressure. Atrial refers to atria of the heart, right? Natriuretic refers to stretch, or actually it refers to a salt concentration. Okay? So, this is released from the atria of the heart. So, when you have a large preload, a large amount of blood volume coming back to the heart, the atria stretch. Okay? When they stretch, the baroreceptors in the atria recognize that, and then they start to produce this because they don't want to overstretch. That means they're recognizing that there is a high blood volume. Your kidneys are doing their job. They're actually working too good. Let's settle down. Okay? So they're stretched. And this causes, then that hormone's release causes vasodilation, which decreases peripheral resistance, and then increases urine output, and that lowers blood volume. Now the way this works, natriuretic refers to sodium ions, Na, right? That actually is going to stimulate the release of sodium ions out of the body, and when you release sodium ions, water follows salt. Water follows with sodium ions are released, water goes with it. Okay? So that where you actually increases urine and it lowers blood volume. All right? So these four hormones work together to increase and decrease blood pressure. Okay? They all integrate together. All right? So then you have your homeostatic mechanisms cardiac output, resistance, blood volumes. All right? They all directly relate to pressure, and increasing any of them, increased blood volume, increased cardiac output, or increased resistance will lead to an increase in blood pressure. All right? But how you do it and how your body regulates it, right, are all those different inputs are possible areas where it can be controlled. All right? So here's cardiac output. Heart rate, we could change heart rate to regulate blood pressure. We can change stroke volume. And stroke volume depends upon how much blood is coming back to the heart, right, and then how much is expelled out. You alter stroke volume, heart rate. This is cardiac output that we're controlling. All right, and then we can regulate peripheral resistance. Right, there are three things: vessel radius, vessel length. This vessel length tends to be pretty stagnant. Okay, it's really not going to lengthen very quickly. Okay, but the vessel radius is very quick, and blood viscosity, right, the thickness of blood. Again, these two things tend to be less, more time, less time sensitive, while vessel radius is much more quick response. Right, the other two are longer time response. Questions on the relationships of blood pressure, cardiac output, resistance, heart rate, blood volume, especially blood volume. I think it's a big one. Okay, and then you have blood volume, factor that regulates, right? So fluid in should equal fluid out. How much you consume and you drink should equal how much you lose in the day. Therefore, there's no net loss. Okay? But if you consume more and you produce more, you need to get rid of more. If not, you end up with a higher blood volume and you end up having elevated blood pressure. Okay? But increasing blood volume can lead to increase in blood pressure. So, what is hypotension and hypertension? Hypertension is chronic elevated blood pressure, high blood pressure. Systolic over 140 or diastolic above 90. All right, what this leads to can damage blood vessels and makes, atherosclerosis and arteriosclerosis much more evident. The walls get thicker. In response to that added pressure, the walls thicken. All right, you're putting something under a pressure and a stimulus, and the body will respond to that. They respond to that by hardening the arteries, more connective tissue, more muscle, and it makes it less easily stretchable, which causes problems. All right, it's a major cause of heart disease in the United States. Okay, and what's the first thing? Go to any of you have grandparents or grandparents that have been diagnosed with high blood pressure, heart disease? Okay, the first thing that the doctor does when he talks about this is what? Talk about regulating blood pressure. What's the first thing that they'll talk about? And the easiest thing that you can control in regulating this. Diet. Diet is the first thing. Okay? And the biggest culprit is what? Salt. Sodium. Right? And I just said I want you to remember this when we talk about the renal system. Where salt goes, where sodium goes, water follows. Okay? So if you have a diet that's high in salt, that's being absorbed in the stomach and going into the blood. Where's water going? Water goes with it. Okay? So you end up having all of that, retaining that much water because you have salt going in, water follows. Okay? When you get rid of sodium ions and you excrete them through the kidneys, water goes with it. Okay? So the first thing that in responding to hypertension would be diet. Lifestyle changes in diet. Usually lower sodium, and then increase exercise to help lower blood pressure. On the flip side, we have hypotension, right, which is chronically low blood pressure, symptoms, fatigue, dizziness, fainting, right? There's not enough pressure to deliver the blood to where it needs to go, okay? And this is characterized by systolic pressure less than 90 or diastolic less than 60, right? And that's chronic. That's not just, standing up quickly. This is just this is the way it is all the time. And then finally you have orthostatic hypotension, right? A drop in blood pressure after sudden standing. And you may have all experienced this. You're laying down on the quad out here, nice early spring day, right? And then all of a sudden, oh crap, I had to run to class. Dr. Vale-Cruz is giving a quiz today. And you stand up quick. In some cases, you get a little dizzy, you get lightheaded, right? Because you've changed body position and it causes a transient, temporary drop in blood pressure, right? In some cases, some people might faint from certain things like that.
When that happens, my vision goes.
Yep. Yep, it's
normal?
pretty normal. Okay. You get a little spotty vision, right? Yeah, that's pretty normal. Okay. And in this case, your blood pressure regulation just isn't happening quick enough. It's completely normal for the most part, as long as it's not causes any real problems when you're just like sitting here and standing up. Normal movements. Okay. I included a couple different figures in here. Okay? There's a couple different renal mechanisms that help regulate blood pressure. Okay? So on the right over here, I'll make it bigger so you can see it. Okay? If there's a decrease, a lowered amount of arterial pressure, right? Filtration in the kidneys is going to go down. What that means is it's not going to allow as much water to go past the kidneys. What does that do to blood volume? Well, let's do it right down here. Urine formation goes down. What does that do to blood volume? It makes it go up, right? Blood volume goes up. What happens to pressure? That goes up, okay? So the kidneys work directly, in this case, directly to regulate blood pressure just by regulating the absorption or excretion of water. Okay, that's a direct mechanism. Then over here, you have all this indirect mechanism. Okay, and here's your angiotensin 2, Renin-Angiotensin System, right? ACE is angiotensin converting enzyme, which will convert angiotensin 1 to angiotensin 2. And then now that works at the adrenal cortex, recruits aldosterone, increases ADH, thirst mechanism, vasoconstriction. Up goes peripheral resistance. This now increases blood volume. What happens to, in this case, mean arterial pressure? What happens to blood pressure? It goes up. Okay? So it's a little flow chart. There's this one, and I'll post these, and then there's this one. All right? These are factors that all increase mean arterial pressure, because that's what we're looking at. On this side, what do we have? Cardiac output. Over here we have peripheral resistance. Okay? And we went over the activity of the muscular pump and the respiratory pump. Those two things do what? If they become more active and you start breathing more, what do they do? What does the venous pump or the muscular pump and the respiratory pump, what do they help do? What's their function? I hear whispers. If you're whispering, you might as well just say it.
Increase venous return.
They increase venous return. More blood going back to the heart, that means there's more preload, leads to a higher stroke volume. Okay? That increased venous return, stroke volume goes up. Then you have ANP, you have fluid loss, crisis stressors. All of these are stimuli. Then these are in green are the response, and then in yellow is the result. Right? Increased cardiac output, increase peripheral resistance. Eventually, you're going to increase mean arterial pressure, overall blood pressure. All right? So I'll put those two on there so you can kind of go through where things are. Everything we talked about in both neural and hormonal control are on these two slides. Okay? Questions? So, let me ask you, what happens during exercise? What happens to blood pressure during exercise? It increases. What happens to cardiac output during exercise? It increases. What happens to peripheral resistance? It decreases some places, it increases other places. Right? Depends. So it depends. Right? And so during exercise, blood flow is going to change. Okay? Because it's a sympathetic nervous system input. When you have exercise, heart rate's going to go up, and blood flow is going to change because capillaries and arterioles are responsive to epinephrine and norepinephrine depending upon the receptor that's on those blood vessels, alpha or beta receptors. And if they're alpha receptors, they'll be constricted. Okay? And if it's beta receptors, they'll be dilated. So flow changes. So you have flow. Blood flow to the skin increases during exercise. Right? So that you can perspiration, dissipate heat, and help regulate body temperature. Right? Less blood goes to the abdomen. Less blood goes to the kidneys. All right? Skeletal muscle gets more blood flow to deliver nutrients and remove wastes as the muscles contract. All right? So it's a change in blood flow in response to exercise, and then part of it is being responsive to the sympathetic nervous system input that exercise creates. All right? Think about it like this. At rest, where things go, and then things change when you increase cardiac output. And blood pressure will also be altered. Not too much, right? Blood pressure is going to go up, but it's going to stay within it's not going to be a point where it's going to cause detriment to your body, right? It's going to have an elevated blood pressure for a period of time, and then it's going to come down. This gets bad when you have elevated blood pressure chronically, all day, at rest, etc., right? For a long period of time. That can cause problems with the artery. Okay? We'll stop there for today. On Monday, we'll finish this chapter. We'll go over the special circulations, right? And then that's it. This chapter, for your exam in class, we will not cover all the arteries and all the veins, all right? We'll cover the ones that I talk about in class, special circulations. The other ones, what they are, you need to know those for labs. All right, so Monday, we'll have about, I think it's like 7 slides, and then we'll move on to the next chapter, the lymphatic system.
So we have a test on this.
The 9th.
The Friday.
The Friday before spring break.